Here we are. We're welcoming our guests right now. So.
All right. Hi, everyone. They can't respond. So
no, they can't respond, but it's nice to acknowledge. I mean, like it's one of those things that I think we're all trying to get used to, even though we've been dealing with Zoom for so long. Is like, especially with teaching, is like talking at a screen but not being able to actually see people. Like I do this all the time. I start pointing at the screen and like nobody knows what the hell I'm pointing at, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense.
Also, both your universities are going to be online this fall, right?
No, yeah. Well, some classes, but not others. There's a lot of controversy about that, and I'm being recorded right now, so I'm not going to say anything else about it.
That's right. This will be on YouTube for posterity.
Yeah.
Let's be clear. So Virginia Tech has been pretty good. I think I saw something from the provost office, like about 30% of our classes are going to be in hybrid or face-to-face in some way, but the rest are going to be online. I mean, I don't know how long that's going to last when the students come back, and if there's any sort of outbreak where we might just have to jump to online really quickly. So as a department chair, I'm counseling my faculty, like, be ready to be online, like, right away. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're another hotspot once again. We were a hotspot in April, and now we're a hotspot once more. We figured it out, and now we unfigured it out. And so who knows what things are going to look like. Luckily, we don't go back. Louisiana Tech doesn't go back until after Labor Day anyway, usually. So
yeah, so sadly, the Bay Area, I think, initially avoided generally the first wave, and now like Berkeley is a hotspot again, I think, sort of. So a bunch of people at the university are freaking out. I think we're mostly online this fall. So yeah. Okay, well, this is about time. We're just gonna jump into it. Thank you for joining us on episode 9, 8. I don't actually remember.
I don't know.
I don't actually know. We're such a success here. But this week we have Drew McKevitt, who is a professor at LA Tech, Louisiana Tech. And his first book was Consuming Japan. It was popular culture and the globalization of 1980s America. But now he's working on a very fancy, people should buy it. It's on Amazon, but also from your local bookseller. He is now working on a book on gun violence and its relationship with U.S. foreign relations after World War II. And you're also working on another book, sort of, on U.S. people, like American laborers in foreign-owned factories, right, in the United States? Mm-hmm. Cool. Yes. Well, I guess we should just start with what's everyone drinking today.
Okay, so we got to talk about this, okay?
Okay.
We need to talk about this. So
this is Drinking with Historians. Of course, we have to talk about this. Yeah.
So I'm drinking beer for gastroenterological reasons, but what I'm drinking today is it's a beer from a local brewer the brewer's name is Great Raft. And I'll if you care, I'll tell you what Great Raft means. But this beer, so I mean, it was almost like for me or something. They just put this out, and the beer is called Kampai Style.
Oh my God.
Right. It's almost like they knew I had to like talk to people and drink beer at the same time. Which says dry hopped Japanese rice lager. You can see, you can see on here, there are, I don't know, instructions for like picking up sushi or something like that. And it says, the simplest way to say cheers in Japanese is kampai, meaning dry cup and bottoms up. This lager was inspired by that kampai mentality in the essence of celebration. I don't even know what that means, but I felt like, is this a little bit Orientalist? I'm not quite sure. A little uncomfortable with this, but the aesthetic is sort of like it reminds me of like 1970s, like American Japanese food cookbooks, which I read like 100 of them when I was writing my first book. The kind of aesthetic is like that or something like that. But anyway, so that's what I'm drinking right now. I also have a backup, which is my favorite beer from Great Raft, which is just their sort of standard. It's called Commotion. Anyway, Great Raft is named after the Great Raft. Do either of you know what the Great Raft was?
No, I have no idea.
Here we go. Ready? History already. Here we go. So
we're jumping right in. I love it.
Right in. We're gonna get right down to this shit. So the Great Raft was a giant dam, essentially 25 miles long, that had blocked up the Red River. So the Red River, which most people know is the border between Texas and Oklahoma, it also runs through Shreveport, through my city here. So it splits. Shreveport is on the west side and Bossier City is on the east side. And it had blocked up the Red River for about 25 miles, maybe, you know, about half of it north of here, half of it south of here. And a man named, I'm going to totally screw, I think it's Joshua Shreve. He was the Army, he did something in the Army, engineer, something, who cleared the Great Raft. And so in the process of clearing the Great Raft, this 25-mile long blockage, he gets the city that I live in right now named after him. And so this brewery, which opened up, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, is called the Great Raft. So that's sort of the local lore. Of course, when they tell that story locally, they always omit, like, you know, the impact it had on native populations here, the fact that it was actually like enslaved people who did all of the clearing, and Shreve just oversaw the work and that sort of thing. So, but it's pretty cool to have this brewery that has this kind of local historical connection.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things we've learned really over the last few years is that history is only about white people and about what happens to them and their emotions. So, I mean, like, it just makes sense, right? I mean, like Tom Cotton, Senator Cotton, if you're watching, I mean, like, this is for you, right? So.
Yeah. We understand, Senator Cotton, and your great concern about cancel culture. You've decided to cancel the 1619 Project and proper historical teaching. Just that,
That's right.
I saw that. And then I think a representative from the House, I forget his name, Louis Gohmert, I think, is trying to ban the Democratic Party because it is associated with the Confederacy. So the logic there, I love it. Well,
no need for historians. No need for historians at all. So sorry. Go ahead, Varsha.
I'm drinking Michter's bourbon. Last week I was drinking Hudson, but this time it's straight Kentucky bourbon. Just neat. I don't have any fancy cocktails. I just love.
You don't have any cool history stories about your bourbon?
No, I don't. I should. I really should look this up. I do know that, like, my favorite thing about Scotch in general is that initially, when they started making, I think it is Scotch. Initially, there was like taxation on like a certain amount of mash you could put in like in Scotch whiskey, and so in order to fuck with that and pay less taxes, they started mixing in a bunch of different grains. So that's my favorite Scotch fact. Is to reduce the taxes.
So you're learning, just when you haven't looked anything up, just make shit up. That's the key.
Yeah.
That's the key. I mean, like, I've been teaching for a long time. I mean, that is literally teaching, right? So
I don't know the exact facts here, but that is the truth. They did start mixing up grains to
none of that Great Raft shit was true. I just made all of that up.
That's right.
None of it.
That's right.
100% fake.
That's right.
Do you have a fancy cocktail, Matt?
I do have a fancy cocktail. I decided to do a fancy cocktail. You know, I love straight bourbon, but I decided to do something a little fancy. This is a cocktail called the Remember the Maine, and it was invented in the early 20th century to commemorate the blowing up of the Maine in the harbor of Havana that started off the Spanish-American War. And it has rye whiskey in it, but it also has sweet vermouth, a little bit of absinthe, and then what is the other thing? Oh, cherry heering. So it's a little bit sweet, but it has kind of this licoricey tang and this. So it's really pretty lovely. And since we're going to be talking at some point about guns and shooting people, I mean, it just kind of seemed
and foreign relations.
In some way.
Definitely.
That's right.
Yeah, well,
and I also have for various reasons a tiny little bottle of larceny as a backup.
Oh my God, that's so cute.
It is.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, my head for scale. So sorry.
Yeah. So speaking of guns, Drew, how did you decide to start studying guns?
Oh God. Okay.
Because it seems like
in Louisiana
for me,
too, right? Okay.
Yeah.
As someone who,
I mean, as a medievalist, like, I attract attention, but I mean, like, you know, guns in Louisiana. There you go. So
like, I'm just asking for it. I'm really just asking for it. Yeah.
I was taught to run away from guns, so I don't know how you started.
You were taught to run away from guns?
Yeah, and just never touch them, never talk about them.
Yeah,
they seem very scary.
So I mean, I grew up. Well, I mean, my grandfather was. We'd probably use the phrase gun nut. Not that that really had any kind of impact on me, but that was sort of my youth exposure. When he passed away, this is almost 2 decades ago, our family had to kind of sell off the arsenal, some of which could not legally be sold in the United States for various reasons. So, yeah. So
that's a whole nother episode. So
yeah. Again,
yeah.
I said that on a recording too. The ATF is going to come down here. Well, I mean, luckily the ATF just doesn't give a shit about anything anymore. So I can say whatever. I got an arsenal here. Ooh, they don't care.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a good question. I'm not a trained historian of guns, obviously. And really, there aren't many, I don't know, or any trained historians of guns, although there are lots of historians who work on guns, who have a background in some, say, like the colonial period or the early republic or the 19th century who write about guns, but far fewer of them write about the 20th century. So my background is as a historian of US foreign relations, and I'm interested in kind of post-war social and cultural history. And obviously my first book was about the intersections of consumerism and US foreign relations, and specifically consumerism and the United States relationship with Japan in the 1970s and 1980s. So I wrote about Americans consuming, cars and anime and sushi and electronics and so on. And one of the implicit themes of that, and I usually, when people are like, how the hell did you get from writing about sushi and anime to writing about guns? One of the implicit themes of that book is that we can find US foreign relations in a broad sense in lots of local places. We don't necessarily need to look to the traditional centers of power for US foreign relations when we think about political power, economic power, diplomatic power, military power, and so forth. So sure, we could write about US-Japan relations as a story in the 1970s and 1980s as a story of trade negotiations and continuing disputes over security relations and so forth, but others had done that. And so I wrote about what that relationship looked like on the ground in Marysville, Ohio, for example, where in 1982, Honda opens the first Japanese-owned automobile manufacturing facility in the United States. And so how did the residents of Marysville, Ohio participate in something called foreign relations, broadly broad? How did anime fans engage in a kind of foreign relations? And so I was very much interested in these kind of local manifestations of these global relationships. And that was a question I asked when I arrived in Louisiana in 2012. Like, how did all of these relationships I was thinking about in a local context, this global relationship I'm thinking about in a global context, how did they manifest, if at all, in Louisiana? And I had no idea. And honestly, it probably started with something as simple as like a Google search for like Louisiana and Japan and like what comes up. It wasn't long before I came across the name Yoshi Hattori. Have either of you heard the name Yoshi Hattori before? No. Most people haven't. So Yoshi Hattori was a 16-year-old Japanese exchange student living in Baton Rouge in 1992. And in October of 1992, he was shot to death for knocking on the wrong door at Halloween. In fact, so sort of the story goes quickly. He and his friend were on his way to a Halloween party, and they're going to a neighborhood they don't really know. And his friend is his host brother. So it was the brother he stayed with while he was living in Baton Rouge. Yoshi is dressed like John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever. They pull up to a house and they think they're at the right house, but they mix the numbers up. Yoshi goes and knocks on the door. A white woman answers, sees 16-year-old Yoshi dressed in costume and screams. It's a couple weeks before Thanksgiving, or sorry, a couple weeks before Halloween. She screams, slams the door in her face, and yells for her husband, a man named Rodney Piers, to go and get his gun. And he runs into his bedroom and grabs his .44 Magnum Smith & Wesson hand cannon. And he goes back, he pulls out to the carport door. Yoshi and his friend had started walking away at that point. Yoshi hears the carport door open and starts to go back. And friends would later say, like, Yoshi, because he wasn't very confident in his English, he would often get very close to people just to make sure he's hearing what they'd say. And so Yoshi's walking very quickly towards Rodney. Rodney yells, "Freeze." a word that Yoshi doesn't understand colloquially. Yoshi continues, Rodney pulls the trigger, sends a bullet through his chest, and he's dead within a couple hours. What interested me at first was how this becomes a kind of international incident. So there are all these like condemnations of American gun culture in Japan, like how could any civilized, quote unquote, civilized society allow someone to answer their front door armed, and then to do that when a child has knocked at your door, an unarmed child has knocked at your door. And so, you know, at first, like I'm writing this book on US-Japan relations. I'm like, wow, here's this thing I didn't even know about. And it happens here in Louisiana. It makes some national headlines at the time. But then the more I kind of looked into it, the more it started to seem that the story wasn't so much of one of US-Japan relations, but it becomes a story of like US gun violence and gun culture in an international or global context. And, you know, there's a trial, and the killer, Rodney Pierce, he's acquitted of manslaughter charges. You know, his lawyer, this very New Orleans character, he says after the acquittal, like, this demonstrates that in America, you can answer your door armed to defend yourself, or something ridiculous like that. And again, the Japanese media just sort of blows up. How is this possible in a civilized society or something like that? Anyway, I know I'm going on and on forever here. But the lesser known story, so that kind of makes like national news, but the lesser known story is that in the aftermath, Yoshi's host family, they're named the Haymakers, that's their family. The parents are two professors at LSU in Baton Rouge. They found a gun control movement. And the kind of argument of their gun control movement is that the United States needs to learn from the rest of the world. Look at Japan, for instance. In 1992, the United States has 30,000 gun deaths. Japan had 21, I think. In a country of 120 million people, 21 gun deaths. And so their argument is that the United States needs to be more like the rest of the world. We can't keep making these exceptionalist arguments that we're different and that explains our gun culture. We need to be more like Japan. We need to be more like Great Britain. And so it was an idea that really kind of appealed to me. Like, where does this idea come from? That the United States gun culture is different from the rest of the world, and that explains how we are. And where does this idea come from that this can help us think about American gun violence in kind of as a problem? You know, we might say today that the Haymakers tried to change the narrative of gun violence to make it one of kind of a question of the United States difference with the rest of the world. And so that just set me off on a whole kind of archival chase, I guess. And really what happened was that, you know, I had these questions in my mind for several years. I did a little bit of archival research because the Haymakers left their activist records at LSU. So it's one of the very few kind of gun control archival records in the country. And so I had these questions in my head. I applied for a grant. I got a year off to write this project, and I just went crazy and did as much work as I can over the last, I don't know, 15 months or so. And here I am today.
Wow. It's very similar. The first time I sort of saw that sort of effect that you saw between the United States and Japan over gun culture, I saw in 2017, the Olathe, Kansas shooting. So I'm very in touch with Indian news and what's going on in India, just because I work on US-India relations, and I'm very interested in like the current administration in India. And so in 2017, when 2 Indian men are shot in a restaurant in Olathe, Kansas, everyone in India, especially because his wife and the main guy, Srinivas, and his wife are from India. They're like immigrated to the United States recently. Everyone in India is furious at American culture. And Indian parents for months, and probably even now, are still worried about sending their kids to the United States for college. And this is it's also something that you see in anytime you talk to like it's like a trope now, but like anytime you talk to a British person and you sort of criticize Britain in general, they're like, well, at least we're not being gunned down in the street like the United States.
That's I can tell you they were saying that in the 1960s too. It's not a new thing to say. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really, you know, that's the sort of thing like I wanted to know about, right? Because there have been other incidents of either foreign nationals or whomever being killed in the United States, and there being international reaction against it. And so, you know, to me, like I was thinking like, well, Yoshi's maybe, you know, this starts here in the 90s because gun violence is really increasing in the late 80s and into the early 90s. And I don't know, globalization or something makes Americans or makes the rest of the world more tuned to American violence or something like that. But it's an old history. I mean, I went back to the 80s and the 70s and the 60s and the 50s, and it's there almost from the start of the post-war era. And so you know, that thing too about warning like parents and stuff. What happens in Japan after Yoshi's death is that like the Japanese travel ministry starts publishing like pamphlets on colloquial English, because the idea what it becomes known in Japan as the freeze case, because what the Japanese media gets fixated on is whether or not Yoshi knew what freeze meant colloquially, and it's never entirely clear. The defense tried to claim like, oh, he didn't know English, that was the problem, which wasn't true at all. He actually spoke very good English, and you know, may have even known what the colloquial phrase freeze meant. But there's all these Japanese pamphlets that say like, what does stick 'em up mean, or you know, things like that, these kind of like colloquial terms for crime, that the Japanese government is warning its own travelers about, because this is also an era of increased Japanese tourism around the world, because Japan is a very, very rich, I mean, obviously still a rich country, but the bubble is just beginning to burst. And so Japanese tourists are all over America at that point. So, yeah.
So when did this change? Like you were talking about kind of looking at, you know, 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, and this kind of language about kind of warning foreign nationals about visiting and kind of the violence of American streets and because of guns and stuff like that. I mean, one of the things that, you know, you've tweeted about very, very often is like these old NRA ads, and how the rhetoric of the NRA, for example, about guns has really radically changed over time. But here you're saying at least that this rhetoric is very consistent. Is that fair? Or
yeah, I think so. I mean, I would say that in the sense of thinking about the United States as a dangerous place full of gun violence, that goes back to the 1960s. And it starts to the very earliest rumblings of it are after Kennedy's assassination, John F. Kennedy's assassination, and it really peaks with Robert Kennedy's assassination in 1968. And you know, one of the ways you know that is that, for instance, the U.S. Information Agency, which is gathering foreign media all the time and processing it and analyzing it and sending it back, sending it to the White House, sending it to federal agencies, they're writing about international reactions to American gun violence. And at least in 1967 and 1968, they're writing about international reactions to King's assassination, to RFK's assassination, to the urban uprisings. And they're writing about how the rest of the world is looking at the United States and saying, this is not civilized. This is not how a civilized people behaves, and that sort of thing. So I didn't expect to find it that far back. I wanted to, I mean, that was the idea, is like, let me find that discourse and where that begins. And that set me off on finding other kind of international connections too that I hadn't anticipated. But that goes back to the 60s.
So is the response from not just the NRA, but like proud American gun owners to like this, you know, reaction they're seeing from international news organizations and just international people to like hold even closer to their guns? Is that do they start making the argument that no, guns are what make us civilized? Or like, what is the defense here? You know, like why? I think that's my interest in this, is more like, why is it that gun culture has survived? Is it just like a patriarchal like male thing, or is it something deeper?
It's probably an all of above thing, right? All of the above thing. It certainly the patriarchal male masculinity thing is tied up in gun culture in the 60s, and it really starts to emerge. One of the things I think that's really interesting is the sort of shaping of like the gun owner identity, which is not to say like someone who owns a gun, but someone who politically identifies as a gun owner. And that process really happens in the 1960s. And it's happening sort of in tandem with the first post-war rumblings of serious gun control legislation. So that really begins in like 1963, and it's even before Kennedy's assassinated. Thomas Dodd, he's a senator from Connecticut. He's the head of the very influential juvenile delinquency subcommittee in the Senate, which just sounds like, you know, what they were doing in the 50s was like investigating comic books. But they turned their attention with Dodd, they turned their attention to guns, because Dodd is convinced that every 15-year-old is going out and buying a cheap handgun and just going out on the street ready to rumble and shoot other people. And so Dodd begins a series of investigations. Really, the investigations begin in like 1961, and then the hearings begin in 1963. And he's just going on and on for every year, putting forward some new kind of gun control proposal. And I think, you know, we often, like, we think about the NRA or like gun rights advocates or gun culture in general as this kind of ahistorical thing or this transcendent thing that's always been there from the very beginning. But I think that that concept of the gun owner really emerges in the 1960s around like Dodd's hearings, because that's where the NRA learns how to fundraise on what's going on politically, how to kind of mobilize its base. That's when they start bragging that, you know, if you put forward a gun control bill, we're going to have a 500,000 letters on your desk within 72 hours. That's when they first start doing that thing. There's a lot of, this is kind of a historiographical question about the NRA, but a lot of times when scholars write about the NRA, they see 1977 as this turning point because there's the annual convention in Cincinnati, and there's a coup in which the hardliners in the NRA overthrow like the old farts who want to like keep talking about hunting and conservation and stuff like that. But really the radicalization starts in the 60s, and it's because Dodd, for whatever reason, I don't know if he's necessarily sort of altruistically motivated, he just likes the headlines he gets from this. But every year Dodd is holding new hearings. At one point, Ted Kennedy is like, what the hell are we doing? I've sat through like 350 witnesses so far, and they all keep saying the same thing. Can't we just vote on a bill already? But I think that helps radicalize the NRA and turn it into a kind of gun rights organization. And helps, I think, shape gun culture into what it becomes. We don't often think about gun culture as a reaction to gun control, but it is very much shaped in a sort of dialectical relationship in that sense. I don't think you have gun culture, quote unquote, and the NRA as they becoming what they become by the 1970s without them reacting against control efforts.
So, and how does race play into this? I mean, you know, if you're talking about kind of like violence and images of American violence, and you're talking about kind of the uprisings in the 1960s, congressional hearings and stuff like that. I mean, like the civil rights movement, and of course, kind of, you know, especially the portrayal of the NRA as a predominantly white organization nowadays. So what in the early days, especially, like how does race play into this development of this kind of gun culture?
Yeah, I think it helps to kind of accelerate and radicalize it, and maybe politicize is even a better word. Of course, this is all works in progress here. These are, I mean, I shouldn't say, this is not a published book we're talking about here. This is, you know, I've got maybe 2/3 of this thing written. But I think the racial conflict of the 1960s helps to politicize and maybe even radicalize the NRA and that gun owner identity. Because it's beginning in the late 1960s, you see a shift in the rhetoric away from, for the NRA, for gun rights advocates, away from we're doing this to protect the rights of hunters and sports shooters who shouldn't be inconvenienced by laws that punish the law-abiding citizen, et cetera, et cetera. We're doing this for people who want to defend themselves. And 1967, 1968 are the really kind of the crux there. When you get sort of the uprisings in Detroit, even as far back as Watts in 65, in Detroit and Newark and elsewhere in 67, the uprisings across the country in the wake of King's murder in April of 1968, there is a white backlash to that. And there are countless stories of white people going out and buying guns. There's all these stories in the Detroit press after July 1967, the uprising in Detroit, of white populations going out and arming themselves, going to local police stations to get marksmanship training. There's these sort of like these stories that are supposed to be meant like, I don't know, cutesy or charming or something, of like suburban housewives going with their new handguns and learning how to shoot from the local police department or something like that. Nice. And so, you know, I don't, that's one of the things, like when we talk about the uprisings of the 1960s, we don't talk enough about how violent they were, at least in terms of like people arming themselves. And that's really, I mean, one of the kind of bigger things that I think is emerging in my work is that we need to think more about gun history as a material history, as like people arming themselves and hundreds of millions of guns in the country. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for social life? What does that mean for political life? Often when people write about the history of when people write gun history, it's a history of kind of rights and law. It's sort of tracing interpretations of the Second Amendment. And that's important stuff. But I mean, the numbers are just incredible. Like, nobody ever wrestles with the numbers. Like in 1945, as best we can tell, because it's really hard to ever know exactly how many guns there are in the country. In 1945, there were probably about 45 million guns. That number doubles every 25 years up to today. 45 million up to about 100 million in 1970, up to about 200 million in the middle of the 1990s, up to maybe as many as 400 million today. That's just incredible. The American population doesn't grow almost tenfold from 1945. I think it's maybe 140 million, 150 million at the end of World War II.
Well, it's been pretty consistent too. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, right, is the number of people or families who own guns has decreased over that time as well.
That's right. As a percentage of the population, the number of households with guns keeps going down, which means that the number of people who own guns, how many guns they own, has gone up. I think in 1980, in 1980, I think it was the average gun owner owned 3 or 4 guns, and today I think it's maybe 7 or 8. I'm probably totally wrong about all these numbers, but
we talked about this. You just make stuff up if you don't know. So.
That's right. Just make shit up.
I have so many questions right now, but I'm gonna restrict myself to 2. My first question is...
This is a job interview, Varsha.
Okay.
Well, maybe it is.
Maybe it is. Yeah. I don't know.
You never know. Princeton could call you at any moment.
That's right. I got my phone. I'm here. Call me.
We have a running joke that Drew's parents want to see if he'll just send a resume to Princeton, and if Princeton has gotten back to him.
You know, I was the first person to graduate from college in my family, and I went to college. I was supposed to be a doctor. They're like, "You're the smart one. Be a doctor," and I became the wrong kind of doctor. And so, like, it was always very hard explaining what graduate school was, like what I was going to do in history. And so, you know, family members, because I grew up in Jersey, they're like, "Well, why don't you just send your resume to Princeton? Like, that's all it takes.
Yeah,
just email it to them, and you'd have a job already. What are you worried about?" Anyway.
Well, I mean, yeah, Kevin Cruz follows me on Twitter, so I'll put it in.
That's right. He follows me too. Yeah. So yeah, I'm DMing him all the time. Like, come on, Kevin, give me a job. What are you doing? Yeah. Come on, man, hire me.
So my first question was just, is there, I don't know, I know you don't study this specifically, but are all these guns produced in America? And if not, is there a relationship between like gun manufacturers that aren't American and them trying to stoke this type of gun culture? Or is there a certain type of American gun manufacturer that's like aligned with the NRA? That was my first question.
I'm just going to read chapter 2 because this is like all of chapter 2 of the book. Okay. It's like, I'm so ready to talk about this. I don't even know
what's the capitalistic link to gun culture? That's my question.
Okay, so here's the thing.
Such a tiny question.
No, it's a great question though, and it's one nobody thinks about when we're talking about gun culture, or even 20th century gun culture in the United States. There's a lot of good work on this question in the 19th century, like Pamela Haig's book, The Gunning of America. She writes about Winchester or Remington? Winchester, the Winchester family and kind of the origins of their business. And back into the 19th century too, these companies only were able to survive, especially after the Civil War, because of their international connections. So like Winchester, for example, there was a glut after the war, right? You make a whole lot of guns for the army. You don't need any more guns in the 1870s, especially because so many of those soldiers, they just bring the guns home with them, and there's not like a big gun market there anymore. So where are you going to sell guns? Well, you sell them to the Ottoman Empire. But this question is really important in the post-war era too, because between 1954 and 1968, so 1968 is a really big year. That's when the Gun Control Act is passed. And what it does, among other things, there's a whole bunch of requirements for like gun dealers and information and that sort of thing. But one of its big provisions is that it makes it much harder to import guns, because importing guns was a really big business that we don't think about all that much when we're talking about guns in the United States. Anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of guns sold in the United States before 1968 were imports. And they were one of two things. They were either cheap war surplus rifles. So the American market just eats up millions of guns that Europe doesn't want anymore after the war. There's this guy I write about, his name is Samuel Cummings. He's sort of like mildly famous in like this 1960s, and he's known as like arms dealer Sam. And he gets this kind of international profile because he's doing these like sexy deals between negotiating sales between like third world dictators and Europeans who are trying to get rid of like fighter planes or that sort of thing. But his much more like quotidian business is just selling cheap rifles to Americans. In fact, that's where he makes most of his money. In the 1950s, he's just like he'll like walk into the defense ministry of Finland and he'll throw a suitcase of cash down and say, I want to buy all of your old guns. And the Finnish government is like, we don't want these friggin' guns. They're crap. Let's get rid of them. It takes a lot of money to maintain them. It would even take a lot of money to just dump them in the North Sea, which is often what they would do. And so Sam's like, I'll buy them for like 50 cents each. And the Finnish government is like, yeah, fucking take it. 50 cents each, whatever. Here's 300,000 Mauser rifles. And what Sam would do, Sam set up this very efficient business of importing them. He had a set of warehouses on the docks in Alexandria, Virginia, right next to the Washington Post's printing outfit. And he would bring all of these guns in, he'd clean them up, he'd sporterize them, this was the term at the time, and he'd sell them to Americans. And so he'd buy these guns for less than $1 each from the Europeans, and he'd sell them for $8, $10, $12 to Americans. This is at a time when a company like Remington or Winchester, which makes these expensive hunting rifles, was charging at a bare minimum $80 to $100 a gun. So you could, if you were sort of one of these men post-war America, like we've conquered the world, we're rich, I want to buy guns and shoot shit. If you're one of these men, you can go and spend $100, which is well over $1,000 today, on a fancy rifle from Remington. Or you could buy a $9 Carcano rifle that was made in Italy in 1942 that has some nicks and scrapes and bumps and doesn't look very nice, but at least it'll get you into like hunting or plinking, which is, going out and shooting cans in your backyard or that sort of thing. And so Cummings makes a killing off of it. So much so that in the late 50s, he like provokes the ire of the gun lobby, and they come after him and they try to get Congress to ban these imported war surplus rifles, these guns that were used on battlefields in Europe that are now flooding into the United States, hundreds of thousands of them every year. And so one of the people who puts forward a bill to get these guns banned is a senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. And had that passed in 1958, when he proposed that bill, it would have banned the gun that ultimately killed him, which was an Italian Carcano that Lee Harvey Oswald bought for, well, it was $12.95 plus a scope. It was less than $20. He bought it through the mail from an outfit in Chicago that had gotten it from Europe. So it was one of these war surplus rifles. So this is one of the big ways in which guns are coming into the United States. People like Sam Cummings is throwing cash around in Europe saying, I'll take all of your old guns. And the other way is through cheap handguns, which are being manufactured in Spain, West Germany, Italy. These are guns that are made brand new that are just really cheap, that are being made from like scrap metal lying around from the war. These kind of entrepreneurial West European firms that are taking advantage of like cheap labor and cheap materials and selling handguns that they might ultimately sell in the American market for 10 or 15 bucks. And that compared to their counterparts like Smith & Wesson and Colt and so forth, which are selling guns for $50 or $60 or something like that. And so these two streams are flooding into the United States until 1968, until they're cut off in that regard. So one of the ways in which we, again, like we think about gun culture and the American gun industry or something, and we think about these big manufacturers like Winchester and Remington and Colt and Smith & Wesson and so forth, but they're being slaughtered on the market in the 50s and the 60s by all of these cheap guns, which could be taking up as much as half of the market at some point by 1968. And then things change after 1968, but that's a whole other story. They keep coming in, but in other ways too. So I don't know. I guess I don't have any way of answering that question.
Yeah. We'll move to Q&A now. Matt has seen there's like a bunch of really good questions from the audience, but like in the future, I am going to like pick your brain on the British arms trade because I just find that the coolest shit ever. If people don't know, I mean, the most depressing thing, but also cool as a historian. It's like Britain is like the biggest arms trader of like the world, basically, like one of the biggest arms trader, but also has one of the most like, you know, intense gun control on its own isles, right? So like British people love to poke fun at the fact that Americans are just killing each other, which is true. But Britain also has contributed to the fact that like so many arms across the world are being bought.
Yeah.
So we'll move to Q&A now.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of those sold to the United States. I know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I have to say three things, and then we're gonna get to Q&A. Is that one, based upon what you just said, I don't know if I haven't had enough to drink or have had too much to drink to really process everything that's going on. Second, how is what was his name? Gun dealer Sam, was it?
Sam Cummings.
Samuel Cummings, yeah.
Samuel Cummings. Like, how is there not like a movie of this guy? And why aren't you writing the screenplay next? So, and then third, I will say that.
Call me.
That's
this
right.
is like Dallas Buyers Club, but for like gun nuts and gun importers.
And there's other guys.
Right.
Sam's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many characters who are doing this sort of thing too.
God.
Yeah. I mean, I can see like I can visualize it so well. Like this guy walking into the Finnish Ministry of Defense and just boom, it's like
give me what you got. Yeah.
Give me what you got. I don't care. I'll take it all.
Okay, Q&A time.
So Q&A time. Okay. A lot of amazing questions from our audience, and so we'll try to get to as many as we can in the remaining time. One of those I think I want to start with is about historiography. Is about anybody who studies guns, and even those of us who don't. I mean, I'm a lowly medievalist. Like I'm far divorced from all of this stuff. We had swords, not guns, so it's a different type of problem. Is about the question of the Belle Isle scandal about arming America. And like how has that influenced kind of like how you've approached the project, or even kind of like thinking about how to kind of engage with this? And then a follow-up question kind of maybe after that related. So
yeah, well, I'm gonna need another beer for this one. So.
Yeah, that's right. So I haven't mentioned this before. I haven't mentioned this in this episode, but I always say like the second half hour is not drinking with historians; it's drunk with historians. So
yeah, I'm on my second drink already.
There we go. So this is number 3 for me. No, okay. It's a really good question, and I don't. It's complicated, right? So he writes this book in which I think some people who study guns still see a lot of value in that book, and his own defense is that like, even if you believe I fabricated evidence, it still only affects, I don't know, I think he said something like 12 or 15 pages of a like 500-page book or something like that. Now, as historians are like, yeah, that doesn't make it okay, right? That's still bad. Like lying a few times is not, any necessarily worse than lying a lot of times or something like that. But what I think his book points to, and what we need to do more of, is think about the materiality of gun history, right? So like the controversial claim or maybe the sort of splashy claim he made is that Americans didn't own nearly as many guns as we think they own, right? Like the NRA mythology or the gun rights mythology, you don't necessarily need to pin it all on the NRA, but the gun rights mythology is that every able-bodied white male American or colonial in 1774 was armed with a rifle and ready to go to war. And Balliol said, like, let's count let's find out, is that actually true? And he found some numbers that pointed us to much lower levels than we otherwise might have expected. To me, it like doesn't, okay, so he made it up. That doesn't mean it's still not an important question to think about the materiality of guns,
Sure.
right? Like, because the mythology is everybody's armed all the time and they're fighting all the time. I think Pamela Haig's book, for instance, The Gunning of America, in some ways, does what Balliol's does, but I don't know, I guess a little less controversially, but she demonstrates that like guns weren't everywhere either in the United States at certain points in the 19th century. There's a huge spike after the Civil War because you have all of these veterans going home with their guns, but otherwise guns are expensive things. And if you don't maintain them, they don't work well. The other historians like Saul Cornell have shown, like in the 1790s, like George Washington, I mean, they had to pass another law in 1795 saying like, you have to maintain your gun. That's your job. If you're going to be part of a militia, you have to have a gun that works and you have to maintain it and you have to know how to shoot it. And the fact that they had to pass a law means like a lot of people weren't doing that sort of thing and couldn't keep up with that. So I think, Balliol's, I don't know. Yeah, I just want to sort of sidestep the controversy and say like, on the one hand, like, okay, maybe I'm not talking about the colonial era, but on the other hand, like, let's think about the materiality of guns. Let's stop thinking about Second Amendment questions, legal questions, and so forth, because I think that plays into a mythological narrative that as historians we have kind of an obligation to test.
Yeah. Well, let me follow up on that but sorry, Varsha, did you want to go?
Oh, there's just a really good question from Ian on why he asked, like, why do you think guns became associated with conservative white culture? Because open carry was such a big part of like the Black Panther movement, right? So Black Panthers, used guns to protect their community a lot in California, and that led to, major gun control in California, of course. But why do you think gun culture today, or when, or maybe why do you think it's so associated with like whiteness and maybe Republican whiteness or conservative whiteness?
Mm-hmm. God, I don't know. That's a great question. I just don't know. I mean, there is that moment, and there are arguments too, and I've been thinking about this a lot, that like, for instance, the 1968 Gun Control Act is a law aimed at disarming essentially disarming these Black populations that are arming after 1967, when the Black Panthers march into the California State House in May of 1967. Even that incident is more complicated than that sort of simple narrative. So what's actually, if you read like sort of the local or like the Capitol papers, newspapers in April and into May of 1967, what's actually happening is, before the Black Panthers even show up on the scene, is there are lots of stories about this white, wealthy, he's like an heir to a steel fortune, who is amassing an enormous arsenal in his San Francisco mansion. And it becomes sort of like the local story. Like, everyone wants to know his name's William Thorson. Everyone wants to know what like crazy William Thorson is doing with like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of like World War II artillery and machine guns and all kinds of things in his San Francisco arsenal. And there are a whole bunch of laws being debated before the Black Panthers show up, before the Black Panthers are even making news, about disarming white extremist groups in California, like the Minutemen. And so in some ways, the Black Panthers are so smart because they hijack the conversation. That's what they're really good at. I mean, they're as good at like sort of media and propaganda as anyone. And so in some ways, they make the gun control conversation about them after May 1967. And that law passes in California that Reagan signs. And so there's a lot of attention among gun control advocates to radicalism across the political spectrum. It really, like, I know we say both sides, but it legitimately a both sides thing in the late 60s and into the early 1970s, because there's a lot of concern about these white extremist groups that are motivated by anti-communism, that are going off into the hills, and they're the ones buying like all this World War II surplus. The Minutemen are putting out handbooks on like the best war surplus guns to buy and like the kinds of anti-tank guns you can buy. There's a lot of, Congress spends a lot of time debating like, what should we do about anti-tank guns? Because you could buy a gun in America without like a license or registering it or anything that can blow up a tank. And that's insane. And the people that are worried about doing that are not Black radical groups. They're white extremists like the Minutemen. But then something happens in the 1970s and I can't quite figure it out yet. Like there's greater attention to urban crime, to kind of these small handguns, which are become known as the Saturday Night Special. And the Saturday Night Special itself gets this kind of racial connotation of like Black criminals in urban areas who are holding up defenseless white people and that sort of thing. I don't know. It's such a great question, but I haven't figured it out yet. And I think about it every day as I'm working.
Well, I'm curious, like you were mentioning kind of this change in the 70s, and I wonder if, I'm curious about like what role pop culture plays, right? Like, I mean, the thing that I think about is like the Dirty Harry movies, for example, right? And the valorization of this kind of vigilantism, right? Against, you know, these street toughs and the need to arm yourself and stuff like that. Yeah. But I want to actually take the next question in a different direction, you know, because a couple of people have suggested this is, you know, and I was sharing this earlier, is like one of the few times that I have gotten death threats, right? And I've done a lot of public writing, right? Is I've mentioned the NRA. And so, you know, we tend to think of the study of history as fundamentally divorced from, or trying to be divorced as, you know, the pursuit of knowledge and things like that. But the reality is that we are human beings who exist within like a civilization in a society, and like talking about guns, especially, you know, well, talking about certain subjects, and especially talking about guns, I should say, you know, can bring up certain things. And like, I don't know if you're comfortable talking about that, but like, could you talk a little bit about kind of the challenges in doing this type of work, especially because, you know, you do have a public face, right? I mean, you have you're very active on Twitter and on social media, and you've written kind of other things for popular audiences and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of ambivalence to it, right? I mean, sometimes I'm just like, come at me, bro. I don't care. You know? It's like, you know, on the one hand, I mean, think about like Michael Boliles, right? So like, I'm not going to be like comparing myself, like, I'm just making shit up over here, right? Like he legitimately probably made shit up. Yeah. But you know, he's right. He's at Emory. He's at like a top, you know, an Ivy of the South. And like, I don't know, it seemed like I don't feel like I have that much to lose. It's like, really, come at me. Like, you're going to go after some professor at Louisiana Tech over him writing about guns or something like that? And now I say that, and now, you know, on the other hand, like things have gotten heated. Like last time I taught my gun course, which is 2 years ago, there was an email from a student. So my students had put together this survey of campus, which actually went great. They interviewed they surveyed 1,000 students on campus about a whole range of attitudes toward guns, about Second Amendment questions, open carry, campus carry, that sort of thing. And it went great. But like when one of those like campus-wide emails went out, I got a reply to the effect of like, you know, if you try to take my guns, I'll shoot you. And it came from a student on campus, right? Who was like basically like threatening my class with like, how dare you investigate gun culture or something like that. So things have gotten, I don't know, heated at times. And you know, there are local groups in Ruston on like Facebook or something that don't like the fact that I teach these sort of things. But I don't know, somebody's got to do it. And if like a white guy in the South can't do it, who can do it, right? I mean, like you gotta, I mean, I have certain privileges and this is one of them. I'd recognize if I were not white or not a man, like this would be a lot harder to investigate. And so like, I think, I don't know, I mean, there's a sort of mission there. Like if I can contribute something to this, you know, using my position, I should. But I don't know. I think about it a lot, but I don't really have anything smart to say about it.
I think my final question, sadly, is not a question of the Q&A. It's just something that like really bothers me anytime there's a mass shooting, which is way too many times. Is like the whole conversation like ban automatic weapons. You don't need an automatic weapon, and then like a bunch of gun people will be like, AR-15 doesn't actually stand for automatic rifle. So I guess my general question is, what is the obsession with AR-15s, whatever they are? I actually don't know what they stand for, nor do I care. And how do you generally respond to people who really believe in this logic that guns don't kill people, people kill people?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like,
and
as a public facing intellectual.
Yeah, let me ask you a follow-up question. Please name every gun.
Yes.
And all of their parts. I want to know what the name of all the parts of every single gun in the world. I was made a joke with a friend who said he was going to watch. I said I was going to pull out my book of World War II small arms encyclopedia, and I was just going to read every gun. Arms encyclopedia. So
that'll be just the second hour. Yeah. So.
Just for future reference, Varsha, the AR stands for awesome rifle. That's what it is. Yeah. No, it stands
so many gun people.
I know. It's gonna piss them off so bad. So it stands for Armalite rifle. Armalite's the company that makes it in the 1950s, and they first make it in the 1950s. And in fact, they're designing a new rifle for the U.S. Army, and that. The AR, sometimes we call it a platform, which means like it's a thing you can build other things on. And the AR-15 platform becomes very popular for building different kinds of guns on it. One of those guns is the M16, which becomes the standard rifle for the US Army in the 1960s in Vietnam. After a real kind of mess of like not working well through much of Vietnam, eventually becomes a standard issue rifle for the US military. You know, it's complicated. I think in part the appeal is, and I think, you know, when there's a pretty well-known book called Warrior Dreams by William Gipp. Is it William James Gibson? James William Gibson? It's nice to have books in front of me when I'm talking to people because I can just like look these things. Warrior Dreams, but yeah, that's it. James William Gibson, that's the name. Okay. Who's writing about sort of warrior culture in the 80s and 90s. And this is when people start buying the AR-15. It really starts in kind of the 1980s. And his argument is that they're glorifying warrior culture in the aftermath of Vietnam as a way of making up for the American defeat in Vietnam. And I think that's part of the appeal of the gun, is it connects you as the buyer to not just a gun culture, but a military culture and the sort of militarization of American culture writ large. But I think that militarization does go back further. Like, I think that's part of the appeal of Sam Cummings guns, right? It's like, I can buy a gun that was shooting at Americans in some cases, or US troops overseas, but a gun that saw military service and that sort of thing. So I think that's part of the appeal. You know, when this came up with my students, so my students, they're just an awesome group I had. This was 2 years ago. I would say, you know, there are probably 18 of them. Probably 15 of them identified as like gun rights people, right? So they own guns themselves, or they were all in favor of gun rights. And like every time the AR-15 came up, and they're just like, this is just stupid culture war bullshit. Like, that's why people buy the gun. These are students who themselves are like gun rights people or gun owners. And like, that's why people buy it. It's a culture war thing. I mean, look at that guy in St. Louis, right? Who pulled out his AR-15 and was aiming it at the protesters. Like, what the hell is that guy doing with that gun? It's total culture war stuff. It's, you know, as we'd say, like virtue signaling or something like that. And that's what it is. It's saying like this, it's voting by buying a gun. And gun consumerism, I think, is really important too, in that sense. And we don't talk about enough. I think it's a consumer act. It's a political act. It's a way of connecting to a kind of, you know, 40-year-long culture war or something like that.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, the last most important question Janet asks is there a publication date for the new book? A historian's favorite question.
Yes. No. Okay. So there's a contract for the book, but I haven't signed it yet, so I don't want to announce anything yet.
Okay.
Okay.
But the book is eventually coming out.
Yeah. I don't know. If I'm lucky, 2022 probably, right? So I probably have 2/3 of the thing written right now, maybe even a little more. And so, it's like I only teach 9 classes a year. It's fine. It'll be fine. So, I'll get it done. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for Princeton to call, and then I'll be able to.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah, 9 classes a year, a global pandemic, a civil rights uprising. Like, there's nothing else to think about right now. So you just, as my parents used to say when I was doing my dissertation, is just like sit down between 9 and 5 and write. Like, why is this so hard?
That's right.
This is what I'm in the dissertation phase right now, and my sister was like, sister has no idea what this process is like. She's like, you've only written 5 pages of dissertation? And I'm like, hold on a minute, okay? Calm down.
Like, all you have to do is just stop everything and write. That's it.
That's right. It's just like boom, 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 boom. So I think, we have so many questions that are left unanswered. I think I have a million questions, about kind of the militarization, like the status of perpetual war in the United States, about the increase of the number of guns here. You've talked about kind of this relationship here. We didn't even get to talk about kind of fun pop culture type of things, portrayals of guns in action movies and stuff like that. So I think we could go on for forever. You didn't get to read that whole World War II book of small armaments, to us. There's so much more we could do.
And also, Varsha and I were supposed to be on a panel a month ago, and I was hoping she'd just read her paper.
Such a cool panel.
So that she could read her paper, and then I could offer some comments rather than a question. So
yeah,
but it didn't.
Basically, Schaefer got canceled, and we had the coolest panel ever for Schaefer.
Did have a very
It was
cool
called
panel. That's right.
Guns, Robots, and Dams. It was gonna be so cool.
Such an opportunity.
I hate the coronavirus.
This is the worst thing, literally the worst thing about coronavirus.
Yeah, I hate the coronavirus, and I'm not afraid to say it.
That's right. Yes. So I think we do unfortunately have to wrap up because we're just about out of time. Thank you so much to Drew for joining us. Again, look for that book in 2022. His first book, Consuming Japan, is out right now, available from fine booksellers everywhere. So there were a lot of questions about that as well that we didn't have time to kind of get back to. So thank you again on behalf of Varsha and me. Thank you for joining Drinking with Historians. Join us next week. We'll be thankfully back to the Middle Ages and away from this kind of boring American stuff. But until then, you can look for this up on YouTube hopefully tomorrow. Until then, let me just say cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks.